the illusion of stability, and the historical roots of an endless rivalry. Right now, in the heart of the Middle East, a region long defined by tension, conflict, and shifting alliances, a reality is unfolding that very few are willing to speak about openly. At the center of this geopolitical chessboard sits Saudi Arabia, the wealthiest Arab nation on earth, a country that presents itself to the world as a pillar of stability, a force for balance, a mediator in a region of chaos. But beneath that image, there is strategy, cold, calculated, deliberate. Because behind closed doors, Riyadh is not necessarily working to end the conflict between the United States and Iran. It is managing it, sustaining it, at a level that serves its interests. Not too hot to spiral out of control, but never calm enough to truly be resolved. Because within that tension, Saudi Arabia gains leverage. It reinforces its position. It maintains its relevance. And most importantly, it protects its dominance. This is not about ideology. This is not about emotion. This is realpolitik, a truth rarely acknowledged in public, but one that quietly shapes the modern Middle East. And to understand it, we must go back, far back, to the origins of religion, oil, and power. Because for centuries, the Arabian Peninsula was not a unified state. It was a fractured land, a vast desert controlled by tribes, each with its own loyalties, its own conflicts, its own strategies for survival. There was no Saudi Arabia, not yet. That changed in the 18th century with a pivotal alliance. On one side, a religious reformer, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a man advocating for a strict puritanical interpretation of Islam. On the other, a tribal leader, Muhammad ibn Saud, a man driven by power, territory, legacy. What they formed was more than an alliance, it was a fusion. Religious ideology merged with political ambition. Wahhabism became the spiritual foundation. The House of Saud became the ruling force. And from that union, a dynasty was born. One that would eventually rise to control one of the most strategically vital regions on the planet. A land not just of desert, but of oil, of influence, of power. And from that moment forward, the story of Saudi Arabia became inseparable from the story of global geopolitics. The true paradigm shift came in 1938, when American engineers discovered massive oil reserves in Saudi Arabia's eastern province. In that moment, everything changed. Almost overnight, this desert kingdom transformed into something far greater. It became economically indispensable to the entire global system, and from that moment, a historic unwritten pact was formed. The United States would provide absolute military protection to the Saudi monarchy. And in return, Riyadh would guarantee a stable, continuous flow of oil priced in US dollars. This was the foundation of the petrodollar system, a system that would go on to shape global finance for decades. And for a time, this relationship remained stable, predictable, mutually beneficial. Until 1979, a geopolitical earthquake, the Iranian Revolution, the pro-Western Shah was overthrown, and in his place rose a radically different regime, an Islamic Republic, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This was not just a change in leadership, it was a complete ideological transformation. The new Iranian regime declared itself revolutionary. It openly denounced the Gulf monarchies, calling them corrupt, illegitimate. It branded the United States as the Great Satan. But even more dangerous was what came next. Iran didn't just oppose the existing order, it sought to redefine it. It positioned itself as the true voice of Islam, guided by Shia clerics. And for Saudi Arabia, a Sunni-majority nation ruled by a Sunni monarchy, this was not just a challenge, it was an existential threat. Because beneath the political conflict lay something far deeper, a division over 14 centuries old, the Sunni-Shia schism. Now, it was no longer just a theological divide, it was weaponized. Iran declared itself the protector of marginalized Shia communities across the region. And in doing so, it ignited a new kind of war, not a direct confrontation, but a prolonged, bitter Cold War, fought through proxies, through funding, through ideology, through influence, across the entire Middle East, a conflict that would not explode all at once, but instead burn slowly, relentlessly, for decades. The strategy of economic strangulation and the zero-sum oil market. The hostility that was born in 1979 is not history. It is a living force that continues to shape Saudi Arabia's decisions today. At the core of Riyadh's strategy is a simple but ruthless calculation. The United States-Iran tension must not fully disappear, because as long as it exists, Iran remains contained. under America's maximum pressure sanctions. The Iranian economy has been pushed to the edge, inflation has surged, the currency has collapsed, and the government operates under constant strain. For Saudi Arabia, this is not just acceptable, it is necessary, because a weakened Iran is a limited Iran, and Iran without sufficient resources cannot project power effectively beyond its borders. It cannot fund its allies at scale. It cannot expand its influence freely. The flow of money to Hezbollah in Lebanon becomes restricted. The supply of advanced weapons to the Houthi rebels in Yemen becomes constrained. And that matters, because those same forces have been directly challenging Saudi influence for years. But here is where the calculation becomes even sharper. The moment sanctions are lifted, everything changes. Iran doesn't just recover, it surges. Saudi Arabia has seen this before. After the 2015 nuclear deal, when the Obama administration signed the JCPOA, billions of dollars were unfrozen, returned to Iran, and almost immediately, Iranian-backed proxy groups became more aggressive, more active, more visible across the region. To Riyadh, that was not coincidence. It was a warning, a preview of what a fully reintegrated Iran could become. And so Saudi Arabia acts accordingly, using its influence, its economic weight, its strategic relationship with Washington, through lobbying, through massive weapons purchases, through diplomatic pressure, to ensure that any attempt at reconciliation with Iran comes with conditions so strict, so complex, that true normalization remains just out of reach. The second reason is more subtle, but incredibly lucrative: the global oil market. Because at its core, oil operates as a zero-sum game. When Iran is heavily sanctioned, its vast oil reserves cannot fully enter the global market. And when supply is restricted, prices rise. Less Iranian oil means less competition for Saudi crude. And that has enormous consequences because the entire Saudi system runs on oil revenue. The royal family, the social welfare structure, public sector employment, massive infrastructure projects, all of it is funded by oil. Now consider this. If Iran were free from sanctions, it would not act conservatively. It would act aggressively, pushing for maximum production to revive its economy as quickly as possible. Inside OPEC, that creates tension because increased supply drives prices down. And that is the opposite of what Saudi Arabia wants. Riyadh's strategy is control, manage output, stabilize the market, keep prices high and predictable. So from a purely economic standpoint, every barrel of Iranian oil kept out of the market becomes a silent advantage, a form of price support for Saudi Arabia. And when you scale that across millions of barrels per day over years, the result is staggering. Hundreds of billions of dollars in extended revenue, all sustained by keeping a rival just constrained enough to never fully return. The battle for regional hegemony, religious legitimacy, and the internal Achilles heel. Beyond economics, Saudi Arabia is engaged in a zero-sum struggle for dominance. Just as China seeks supremacy in East Asia, or India in South Asia, Saudi Arabia and Iran are locked in a contest to become the undisputed heavyweight of the Middle East. And in this game, losing is not an option, because losing does not simply mean a stooping influence. It means risking regime survival itself. Now, Iran's strategy is both indirect and highly effective. It operates through what analysts call the axis of resistance, a network not of formal alliances but of aligned militias and proxy forces, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. This includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. Together, they form a crescent of influence, giving Iran something extremely valuable: strategic depth. Instead of defending its borders directly, Iran pushes its defensive lines outward, deep into Arab territory, so that any conflict is fought far from its own soil. And nowhere is this more visible than in Yemen, a war that has become a bleeding wound for Saudi Arabia. By backing the Houthi forces right along Saudi Arabia's southern border, Iran has created a constant pressure point, a battlefield that Riyadh cannot easily escape. From that position, militias have been able to launch drones, ballistic missiles, directly targeting Saudi cities, turning what should be a distant rivalry into an immediate security threat. And this is where the balance becomes fragile, because without continued pressure from the United States through sanctions and containment, Iran would have far greater resources, more funding, more weapons, more reach, allowing these proxy networks to expand, to strengthen, and to operate at their full capacity. The fourth reason strikes at the very ideological core of the Saudi regime. Because the House of Saud does not derive its authority from economics alone. It derives it from religion, from its role as the custodian of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina, the two most sacred sites in Islam. This status is not symbolic. It is the foundation of Saudi Arabia's legitimacy in the Muslim world. But Iran's revolutionary ideology directly challenges that foundation. It argues that a monarchy aligned closely with what it calls the imperialist West is not fit to guard Islam's holiest places. At times, it has even called for these sites to be internationalized, removed from Saudi control. Now imagine a different scenario, an Iran that is wealthy, stable, fully reintegrated into the global system. That version of Iran would not just be a geopolitical rival. It would be an ideological contender, a powerful alternative model of Islamic governance. And that is a direct threat to Riyadh. So by keeping Iran isolated, economically constrained, Riyadh does more than limit its power. It limits its narrative. It prevents Tehran from projecting the image of a successful, superior Islamic state. And finally, we arrive at the most sensitive issue of all, the internal fault line, the Shia question. Inside Saudi Arabia, approximately 10 to 15% of the population is Shia Muslim, and critically, they are heavily concentrated in the eastern province, the very region where the majority of Saudi oil reserves are located. This is not just a demographic detail. It is a strategic vulnerability, because historically, these communities have faced systemic discrimination, creating underlying tension, a sense of marginalization. And Iran understands this. It consistently positions itself as the protector of Shia populations worldwide, using state media to amplify grievances, to highlight inequality, to shape perception. Now consider the risk. If Iran were free from American pressure, free from sanctions, with greater financial and political freedom, it would have the capacity not just to influence externally, but to reach inward, to incite, to organize, to destabilize from within, right at the heart of Saudi Arabia's most critical region, its oil-rich core. And that is a risk Riyadh cannot afford to ignore. The art of perfect balance. Why Riyadh wants neither peace nor total war. This is where the analysis becomes far more nuanced, because Saudi Arabia is not simply choosing between peace and conflict. It rejects both extremes. It does not want peace, but it is equally terrified of a full-scale war. What Riyadh seeks is something far more calculated, a permanent state of controlled tension, managed confrontation, because a direct war between the United States and Iran would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for the entire Gulf. If American forces were to strike Iran, retaliation would be immediate, and it would not be limited to U.S. targets. Iran would respond asymmetrically, strategically, relentlessly. Missiles would not only hit American bases, they would rain down on Saudi Arabia, on the UAE, on critical infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most vital energy choke points in the world, would be shut down. Global oil supply disrupted overnight. But the most terrifying scenario for Riyadh is far more direct. Its oil infrastructure, the backbone of its entire economy. Trillions of dollars in assets, highly concentrated, highly exposed, and highly vulnerable. Because this is not theoretical. It has already happened. In September 2019, a coordinated attack using drones and cruise missiles struck the Abqaiq and Khurais facilities. Attribution pointed to Iranian-backed forces. And in a matter of minutes, half of Saudi Arabia's oil production was taken offline, not for months, not for weeks, but instantly. A single, precise strike revealed a devastating truth. Saudi Arabia can be hit hard and fast, which is why a full-scale war is not an option. Not for Riyadh, because in that scenario, there are no winners, only irreversible damage. So instead, Saudi Arabia walks a narrow path. Not peace, not war, but something in between. A carefully maintained tension, where the threat remains, but the system does not collapse. Therefore, Riyadh's ideal scenario is not victory. It is not resolution. It is stalemate, a state of diplomatic limbo, where Iran remains under constant pressure, economically constrained, starved of capital, its ambitions limited by sanctions and the looming presence of American military power. Aircraft carriers in the Gulf, bases across the region, a constant reminder that escalation has consequences. But at the same time, Riyadh is extremely careful, because it does not want the temperature to rise too high, not to the point where tension explodes into full-scale war. because that would be uncontrollable, devastating, irreversible. And equally, it does not want the opposite. It does not want true peace, because real peace would remove the justification for the American military presence. It would give Washington a reason to withdraw, to pack up, to leave the Gulf. And without that external security umbrella, Saudi Arabia's strategic position becomes far more fragile. So what Riyadh is engineering is balance, a controlled environment where conflict exists but never detonates, where peace is discussed but never fully achieved. And this explains one of the most surprising rivalry in recent geopolitical history: the March 2023 normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China. At first glance, it looked historic, a breakthrough, a turning point. But in reality, it was tactical, not strategic, a move to buy time, to reduce immediate pressure, to cool down the Houthi drone and missile attacks targeting Saudi cities, to create breathing room, and just as importantly, to send a message, not to Tehran, but to Washington, that Riyadh has options, that it can engage with Beijing, that influence in the Gulf is no longer exclusive. But make no mistake, this handshake did not end the rivalry. It did not erase decades of hostility. It simply paused the temperature, adjusted the pressure, nothing more. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia plays another card. It dangles the possibility of normalization with Israel, not as a final objective, but as leverage, a bargaining chip, used to extract maximum security guarantees from the United States, ensuring that Washington maintains a hard line against Iran. Because in the end, every move Riyadh makes serves one purpose: to preserve a system where its greatest rival is contained, its greatest ally remains engaged, and the balance of power never slips out of its control. The bloody geopolitical chessboard and the future of a post-American Middle East. Now zoom out, pull back from the individual moves, and look at the entire board, because what is really being played here is a long game, a preparation for a future where the United States is no longer the dominant force in the Middle East. For decades, American military power has been the backbone of Gulf security, the ultimate guarantee, the invisible shield protecting regimes, securing oil routes, maintaining balance. But over the last 10 years, something has shifted, quietly but unmistakably. The United States has been signaling a gradual retreat, driven by two powerful forces. First, the shale oil revolution at home. America is no longer as dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Second, a strategic pivot away from the Middle East toward Asia, toward China, the real long-term rival. And this shift sends a chilling message to Riyadh. Because for the House of Saud, this is not just a policy change. It is an existential threat. Their entire security architecture is built on American protection. Remove that, and everything changes. Because without the US, a vacuum emerges, a dangerous one. And in geopolitics, power vacuums never stay empty. They get filled quickly, aggressively, by whoever is ready. Iran would push outward. China would expand its economic and strategic reach. Russia would reassert military influence. Turkey would seek regional leadership. What emerges is not stability, but a hyper-contested arena, a multipolar battlefield where alliances shift, conflicts multiply, and no single power controls the outcome. This is the Middle East of the next 20 years, and Saudi Arabia knows it, which is why its current strategy makes perfect sense. By keeping the US-Iran conflict alive, not exploding, but never resolved. Riyadh creates a permanent justification for the United States to stay, to remain engaged, to keep its military assets anchored in the Gulf. Because as long as Iran is a threat, America has a reason to be present, to project power, to protect its interests, and by extension, to protect Saudi Arabia. It is a ruthless strategy, cold, calculated, but entirely rational. Because at its core, this is not about dominance. It is about survival, a monarchy, navigating one of the most volatile regions on Earth, trying to ensure that when the global order shifts, it is not left alone on the board. Yet, to truly understand this grand strategy, you must also confront its cost. Because this is not just a game of power. It is not just diplomacy. It is not just strategy. It is human consequence on a massive scale. The price of this geopolitical chess match is not paid by diplomats, not in quiet rooms, not in air-conditioned palaces. It is paid in blood. It is paid by starving children in Yemen, by families who do not know where their next meal will come from. It is paid by Lebanese citizens trapped inside a broken state, a nation paralyzed, held hostage by forces beyond their control. It is paid by Iraqis caught in the crossfire, living between competing powers with no escape. And it is paid by ordinary Iranians, people whose lives have been crushed under the weight of sanctions. Inflation, isolation, a population paying the price for a conflict they did not choose. This is the hidden reality behind the strategy, behind the calculations. The future of over 400 million people is being shaped not by their will, but by governments relentlessly pursuing power, security, survival, often at the expense of human welfare. And inside Saudi Arabia itself, change is happening. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is pushing forward with Vision 2030, an ambitious plan to modernize the economy, to reduce dependence on oil, to shift away from the rigid foundations of strict Wahhabism. The internal landscape is evolving, opening, transforming, but externally, the reality remains unchanged. Brutal, unforgiving. Saudi Arabia is still a wealthy nation, surrounded by instability, still dependent on a superpower whose attention is drifting, and still locked in a deep civilizational rivalry with Iran conflict, rooted in history, in ideology, in power, one that no handshake, no agreement, no moment of diplomacy can truly erase. So the game continues, quietly, relentlessly. And perhaps the most dangerous part is this: the most powerful strategy is the one no one openly admits they are playing.